So the first step to making this ink friendly is vigorously stirring it. And by doing that, you're not affecting the chemistry of the ink. The second method for getting this ink to be friendly is what we call blending. Blending is where typically 80%, it might be 75% of my total ink requirement is coming out of this can, the can that's difficult, the can that's got the heavily pigmented ink. And then the other 20 or 25% is going to be a matching color out of a can where there is less pigment. And that medium pigmented ink I had, which is this one here, Unimatch, or I might go to Ultra Soft at Union Ink. Both are medium pigmented inks. I would get the matching color white, near 25%, and then I put that in a container like this, and then mix these two together thoroughly. And what we're doing is we're diluting the pigment. And so the ease with which I can stir the ink and the shear of the ink becomes more like the medium pigmented ink. So it's becoming friendly. That's the second thing you could do. The third thing you can do, perhaps, is use soft tan. Now, soft tan has no pigment, so it stirs very easily. It's going to thin out the pigment. It's definitely going to make the ink friendly. The only problem is, if you're doing this with a color ink like white on, say, a black shirt, you're going to reduce the opacity of the ink. The white might not cover the black. So it's probably not a good idea. We would not recommend using soft tan with a white ink on a dark fabric. But there are many cases you might have a very heavily pigmented ink, and maybe you're going on a lighter garment. Maybe the ink is darker than the garment, so adding some soft tan might be okay. So it is an option. And then the last option, the fourth option, the one I hesitate to tell you about because everybody makes a mistake with this, is to use some curable reducer. And this is a very old can. You can tell it's really beat. A can of this should be about a lifetime supply, because what reducer does, it reduces the cohesive factor of ink. And so what happens is when the ink goes through the screen, the ink tends to spread out. And then we lose the resolution of our image. And the ink tends to settle into the garment. So the color of the garment's coming up through the ink film. We don't want those events. We want the ink to stay where it is. So if you're going to use reducer, we would recommend about 3 drops per cup. So I'd put a toothpick in there and shake 3 drops in there. You're going to say, wait a minute, that can't possibly be enough. It doesn't seem like a whole lot, but that's all it takes. And then what's the purpose? We're not thinning pigment. What we're doing is, it's like putting a little oil in there. Reducer is not oil, but you've already got a slippery stencil, a slippery polyester mesh, and what you're going to do is make the ink slightly slipperier so it will release from the screen. It's only to help the shear of the ink. That's all that is for. It is not for thinning ink. If you want to thin an ink, you better blend or use some soft tan. But don't consider this for thinning, because what you'll get is you'll get dot gain, which is where your image spreads out. You get the image settling into the fabric. And if you have any kind of blended fabric, polyester, nylon, whatever, you're going to probably create dye migration, where the dye is lifted out of the fabric and it bleeds into the ink, and you're trying to present your customer with a nice maroon t-shirt for the little leaguers with white numbers, but the numbers aren't white, they're pink, and the boys don't want to be wearing pink. So you don't want dye migration. That's the risk. So if you really want ideal ink, what you want to do is stir it very thoroughly, get as much out of that activity as you can, and then when you pull the stick out of the can, I always do this. I always check to see how quickly that's sheared. That's what I'm looking for. That's ideal. And if it's drawing out like taffy, then I have to do something with that ink, because if it's like taffy, when that mesh pops up off the shirt, it's going to draw the ink up with it. I don't want that. I want the ink to stay down, so the ink has to shear. That's what's important, shear, not the viscosity. Viscosity is a flow concept. I'm interested in cutting ink, cutting to precise dimension. And for that, I have to have an ink that cuts. And that's what sheer is. So that's what you look for, and that's the ideal. And when you get an ink that's that way, then it's easier to print. You're not pulling as hard. There's not as much labor, so it's easier on you. You don't get as fatigued. You're going to get better print quality. You have less chance of stretching the mesh and having colors be out of registration. You're going to get much better print quality, less work, faster printing, better print quality. It's all in getting the ideal ink before you put the ink in the screen. That's important.